All right, thank you everyone for dialing in, calling in today. This is the fifth workshop of the monthly San Joaquin Valley Regional Early Action Planning Workshop Series. Today we're going to talk about a comprehensive housing report that the REAP funding is producing with a few consultant help from across the state. Before I get into that, just want to mention a few house rules. One is we do have a raise hand function, and we have a question and answer function, and there's a chat box. So if you have any questions, we're more than welcome to entertain questions, but we'll probably wait till the end of the presentation to do that. This will be a 1 hour workshop or less. APA credit, I'll send that information post this webinar. When I send the link to the recording to this webinar, I will send the APA credit number for those of you seeking that sort of a certification there. And then all this information will be posted. The PowerPoint you see today and the recording of this workshop will be posted on the REAP website. So today I want to, I'll introduce our panelists, but I want to introduce Robert Phipps first to give you a quick overview on the San Joaquin Valley REAP program. Robert is the Deputy Director of Fresno COG, who are the fiscal agent for the 8 counties of this program. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So as Michael mentioned, this is the fifth in our workshop series, and we noticed quite a few familiar names, so we thought we would forego with the overview that we had been giving generally each session, either showing the video that we produced in conjunction with HCD or a PowerPoint presentation, because we assume by now that many, if not all of you, are already familiar with the broad parameters of the REAP program. Just to recap, $18.9 million in housing planning funds to the San Joaquin Valley 8 Valley COGs that are divided in the pro rata rate. About 5 million of that for specifically for valley-wide activities, of which this workshop is one. So we continue going forward with our other valley-wide activities, including a comprehensive valley-wide housing report for which several of our panelists are participating and helping to write, as well as technical assistance, which we offer in conjunction with each of the individual MPOs. So I will make another pitch, as I do every workshop, that if you are a jurisdiction that needs technical assistance, or a COG that might want technical assistance for one of your jurisdictions, by all means, please get in contact with us. And if you would like more information generally about the REAP program, please don't hesitate to contact either myself or Michael. I believe he's also going to put in the chat a link to our REAP webpage on the valleycogs.org website. And with that, Michael.
Sure, thank you. So today we're going to discuss, this is the second workshop of the Comprehensive Housing Report, which has been a year-long effort looking at existing conditions, barriers, challenges, policy recommendations for housing in the San Joaquin Valley, that housing activities to increase housing production. So with that, we have Ron Whitmore. Can you wave, Ron? So they see you. Ron is with Ramey and Associates, and we have Ryan Lester, Ryan, with Material Harnish, and we have Steve Flint. There he is with Regional Government Services. So Ron, go ahead. I hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you, Robert and Michael. Can everyone see the presentation slides well enough? Great, thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us and taking time for today's workshop. As Michael mentioned, I'm Ron Whitmore, a principal with Ramey and Associates. As Michael noted, I'm part of a team that is focusing on the initial valley-wide REAP effort. Several other firms are also part of our team, including Mintier Harnish, Rincon, Regional Government Services, and Veronica Tam and Associates. And two folks are with me today from that broader team, as Michael mentioned, Ryan and Steve. The three of us will be tag teaming on today's presentation. So just to give you a quick sense of what we'll be covering, we'll initially give you a quick update on the work products from this initial Valley-wide housing report effort. And as part of that, explain, especially for those of you who are new, the approach we took to engaging stakeholders and having their insights inform our work. But most of our time today will be spent providing you a high-level overview of our draft work products. So there then should be time at the end for any Q&A that folks may have about some of the work that we're doing. So to recap, and I think some of you may have been at our workshop in July, but just to recap, there are 4 major work products that are going to come together as chapters in a final report in the coming months. And there were really 2 phases to this work. Phase 1, which was really April through July this year, was focused primarily on outreach designed to inform the focus and content of these work products. We shared highlights of some of that input during our July workshop. Details from this work, including interviews and survey, will be included with the final report. Phase 2 of the project was really the report production, and we've been working on those since August. Today's presentation is focused on key findings from those draft reports. So there were 3 types of input, really, 2 sets of interviews and then a survey. The 2 interviews, first of all, the first set was with housing industry professionals, including developers, real estate professionals, people in the construction trades. Likewise, we did interviews with COG directors and staff. These were all designed to inform, again, the shape of the final work products and report. And then we also heard directly from local planners about the status of housing planning, as well as local housing challenges, successes, and opportunities. Thank you to everyone on today's call who participated in an interview or completed a survey. Again, details about the interviews and survey will be included in the final report. Just wanted to share with you today a brief overview so you have a sense of where the direction for our work came from. So we're gonna, again, today touch on the key findings from the 4 major work products or chapters of the final report. The first will be the regional existing conditions report, which I will cover, and then I'm gonna hand it off to Ryan, who's gonna share with you high-level key findings from the local land use and housing planning work. He'll then pass it to Steve, who will cover the impediments to housing planning and production. And then Steve will pass it back to me, and I'll conclude with some findings related to best practices for housing production. Our report focuses on the existing conditions report focuses on regional demographic, economic, and housing trends, including notable distinctions among counties and between the region and the state. The written report is supported by a detailed Excel workbook of data, charts, and graphs. Today, I'm only going to share a small sampling of some of the key insights in that report. And much of this shouldn't be a surprise, although we would be very curious to know if anything strikes you as unusual or interesting or different than what you might have expected. About 1 in 10 Californians live in the San Joaquin Valley region. The 4.2 million people who live in the valley are concentrated in counties with large urban centers. The region grew very quickly at the end of the last century and continues to grow, but at a much slower pace. The region experienced only a 0.9% annual change in population size over the last decade, the lowest rate of change in the last 5 decades. Housing production has followed a similar trend, but at a slightly different rate. Housing production in the Valley region is at the lowest point in decades. Much of the detailed data that we use in the existing conditions report are from federal sources like the census, but there is a lag in the availability of data. Therefore, we draw on some other resources for more recent housing data in the region, including the Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD's data based on housing element annual reports. According to HCD, just over 58,000 units were built in the region from 2015 through 2019. Fresno, Kern, and San Joaquin counties have produced the most housing units during the 5th cycle. According to analysis from the California Housing Partnership, as shown on this slide, through 2019, the San Joaquin Valley region faced a shortfall of over 122,000 affordable homes to meet the housing needs of existing extremely low-income and very low-income renter households. This slide shows that affordable housing deficit by county. We're also able to get more recent local data from Zillow. Since the low around 2012, home sales prices in the metro regions in the valley have steadily climbed. The median home sales price in the 3 metro areas of the valley are at the highest point since the Great Recession. In fact, as of August of this year, the median home sales price in the Stockton area exceeded $500,000, which is the first time median home sales prices have eclipsed that $500,000 mark in the valley. But there remain significant regional differences, as you can see in this chart. Although Fresno and Bakersfield metro areas had comparatively lower median home sales prices of just over $350,000 and just over $300,000 respectively, they are still historically high for their respective metro areas. Rents have followed similar patterns also at their highest point in years. As of September of this year, the typical observed market rent was nearly $1,500 in the Bakersfield metro area, $1,800 in the Fresno metro area, and $2,450 in the Stockton area. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, rents have risen across the valley. However, they have risen particularly rapidly in the Stockton area, increasing nearly $500 in less than 2 years. Housing costs are typically the largest portion of household monthly budgets, so it's useful to think about those costs relative to household income. According to the ACS, the Census American Community Survey 5-year estimates, the median monthly housing cost for the valley was about $1,156, which is about 24.7% or a quarter of the region's median monthly household income. Interestingly, even though housing costs have risen in the region, incomes have also risen. So in recent years, on average, families are spending less of their income on housing. A family is considered cost burden if it spends 30% or more of its income on housing. Since 2009, fewer and fewer households are homeowners specifically are cost burdened, though more than a quarter still spend more than 30% of their income on housing. The picture is a bit different for renting households. Though there has been some improvement in a slight way in recent years, more than half of families who rent in the region are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. I'm now going to pass it off to Ryan, who's going to introduce some of the key findings from the local land use and housing planning section of the report.
All right, thank you, Ron. Yeah, I'm here to talk about the local land use and housing planning section. You can go to the next slide, please. So this chapter provides an overview of land use, housing, and zoning practices related to housing production, as well as accommodating the RHNA and updating housing elements. And we've based it on statutory requirements, the stakeholder and MPO director interviews that Ron mentioned, current planning practices, the city and county planning staff surveys, and valley-wide research. So the chapter really looks at providing a background on key planning topics relevant to housing production and the range of planning and regulatory responsibilities of valley cities and counties. And then we get into the challenges facing local governments and the resources for addressing those challenges. The chapter is separated into 5 broad categories: general plans, housing elements, zoning codes, infrastructure, and governance. And we covered 22 key topics, and we'll go through them quickly here. So for general plans, the section focuses on policies and programs, annual reports, and community engagement. Housing elements, we look at annual housing element reports, APRs, available sites inventory, affirmatively furthering fair housing programs, AFFH, and housing trust funds. For zoning, we look at a number of topics, including ADUs, objective standards, density bonus, missing middle housing, and more. And then infrastructure, we looked at water systems, wastewater, flood control and management, utilities, and telecoms and broadband internet. Finally, under the governance section, we looked at annexations and MSRs, disadvantaged unincorporated communities, and staffing capacity. So those are the topics, and on the next slide, we'll get into we've pulled a few example recommendations from the section to present here. So those would be to increase state and regional technical support, to prepare AFFH data packages, either on a valley-wide or MPO basis, and to consider forming multi-jurisdictional or regional housing trust funds to expand funding sources. And then a few more, to update zoning codes to include innovative zoning provisions and to expand the type of residential uses permitted by right. And then finally, to consider a general plan zoning maintenance fee to cover staffing costs associated with the housing element. So those are just a few of the recommendations we've pulled from the draft section, and each of the subsections has its own recommendations within it.
All right, I'll take it from here. Thanks, Ryan. So I'm Steve Flint. I'm with Regional Government Services. We are part of the team working on this report. And I will be talking a little bit about impediments to housing production and planning. Although, when we go to the next slide, you see the topics we generally deal with. A number of them sound like, well, infrastructure constraints. While we sort of have negative connotations with some of these, what we're trying to do is actually point out the areas that we can really improve and take advantage of. First one, under infrastructure, we talk about, if we could change that slide, please. Under infrastructure, we're talking about identifying and prioritizing areas where infrastructure needs are greatest. As you know, in the past, a lot of jurisdictions have fought the concept of leapfrog development. In other words, development that expands farther out than their infrastructure actually covers. I think the idea here is to focus more on areas that already have that infrastructure that can be improved and utilized for new housing and new development. And through that, we're looking at new growth areas and also evaluating funding opportunities and finance options. And hopefully, if Build Back Better gets through the Senate, we will have more to deal with there. Next topic is the capacity to deliver housing. And by this, we talk about areas that we can try to improve on the delivery of those housing elements. So things like eliminating discretionary permitting, use permits, conditional use permits, going more towards uses by right, administrative approvals, streamlining CEQA, all of those to try to improve the timing involved with the approval process. And then to secure staffing capacities, a lot of cities, counties, special districts are going through difficult times, securing staff, maintaining staff, and retaining staff. So there are other areas that we're looking at, such as pay for service models, where a developer will actually pay for the services provided by, say, consultants. Not to beat my own drum, but it is a process. a way of getting projects approved and completed quickly without having to incur more staffing and more staff costs that way too. And then also to create incentives and requirements for affordability. I think cities and counties could do a lot more with the incentives that the state has for providing affordable housing, particularly where concessions are involved, where you can actually modify requirements for setbacks, density, lot coverage, building heights, things that allow greater development and eases the constraints on the sites themselves. Next slide, please. So one aspect that is difficult for everyone to deal with is prevailing wage. It's a subject that is not going to be going away anytime soon. It is pretty much mandatory in most jurisdictions at this point, and will continue to be that. What we are trying to recommend, and hopefully the recommendations will go forward, is that people rely more on things like apprenticeship programs, workforce development. That would also include providing for workforce housing within a specific plan area or within a general plan as amended. Both those can help create more skilled labor in the process. I think not every kid was meant to go to college, and I think there should be more trade schools. That's just my own personal feeling, but that's an aspect that I think people should be looking into more. Then we get to market feasibility and affordability for higher densities. So here we're recommending, again, increasing the skilled labor force, dealing with material shortages and construction costs, which is an ongoing struggle. It's especially bad now with the shortage of materials being shipped in, all the log jams created in the various ports. And that is something that will be dealt with eventually, but in the short term, it is definitely having an effect on how housing is provided. And in the interim, again, going with some more innovative zoning changes to the zoning code, changes to objective design and development standards, taking the guesswork out of the planning process and the approval process. All of that would facilitate the timing involved, which is really a cost-saving measure for the most part. And then within more urban settings, we're looking at reducing lot sizes, possibly increasing densities. The elimination of single-family zoning is an area that would be something to look into, and many communities have done that already. And then incorporating higher density into mixed use areas, more of a specific planning process. Mixed use development projects are primed for that type of development. And then finally, we're talking about local funding barriers and lack of state federal funding. That is a problem, but hopefully, again, there will be more funding available in the future. And in the meantime, we'd be looking at things like establishing trust funds, using housing successor agency funding that still exists to an extent. Many communities have surplus lands that they can free up for housing. And a lot of people talk about the capital improvements and other local funds that can be developed and targeted for low income and more affordable housing. In lieu fees from inclusionary programs is also a way to go. And then philanthropic, reduced taxes, and issuing housing bonds are all ways to create and raise more funding for that. Also forming partnerships, working with lower income and affordable housing providers. There are many people that specialize in providing that type of housing, and then working through a streamlined permitting process, assisting with the funding applications, and then modifying the processes and procedures that are applied wherever possible. And then also, where possible, deferring impact fees and waiving other requirements initially are all ways that can be dealt with. And finally, we're talking about regulatory barriers. In particular, we're suggesting amendments to zoning codes to allow for more uses by right. Talked a little bit about that already. Creating objective standards, modifying parking standards, all ways to create more usable land on properties. Revising the permit fee structures. A lot of jurisdictions that have fee structures now have not really looked at their fee structures for many years, and it's an area that really needs attention. And then providing for environmental review through CEQA, providing more program level EIRs, chairing and subsequent addendums to existing environmental impact reports are all ways to, again, reduce the amount of time it takes to process. And I believe that is it for me.
Thank you, Steve and Ryan. So the fourth major work product then is best practices to increase housing production. And as should not be surprising, it really is designed to build on the first three work products that we highlighted. What we know about existing conditions and trends, what we know about the state of local land use and housing planning, and specifically what impediments have been identified across the region. The impediments chapters, just of an interesting note, focus both on impediments to planning and housing production. The best practices section focuses specifically on best practices for increasing housing production. You will see a fair amount of overlap between the topics covered in this section and some of the topics that both Ryan and Steve covered. That is by design. They're treated differently in each section of the report. The impediments and local land use and planning sections focus really on identifying the issues and lifting up potential strategies for addressing them. This best practices chapter focuses specifically on describing and directing people to resources that they would need to take action and implement some of these best practices. This section of the report is really intended to serve as a resource in the preparation of housing elements, implementation of housing programs, and the pursuit of grant funding opportunities. Every community and each local government is unique, so the report was designed to be accessible, to allow people to quickly assess the practice of each best practice, determine whether it might be appropriate in a particular community, and then where to go to learn more about how to tailor that approach to local conditions. The focus and structure of this chapter of the report was informed by the outreach conducted by stakeholders during phase one of the project. Stakeholders identified some of the principal challenges to increasing housing production and identified key insights into local housing successes and opportunities to pursue specific practices for overcoming challenges in the region. So based on that input and the findings from the other chapters of the report, the best practices is a report or chapter is organized into four main topic areas: land use policy and land availability, including regional and comprehensive planning, surplus public and religious institutional land, and infill and TOD development. Secondly, regulatory mechanisms, including zoning code revisions, streamlining of approval processes, and fee reductions and waivers. The zoning code revision section covers objective standards, upzoning, inclusionary zoning, adjustments to density and parking requirements, and housing overlays. The third section, housing production and ownership costs, focuses on things like ADUs, other low-cost housing types, and new approaches to housing ownership. And then finally, the funding and financing sections focus on both infrastructure development and housing production, and they include fees, bonds, trust funds, various districts and authorities, and grants. Within those four topic areas, there are 35 different best practices that are profiled. And each practice profile includes a description, related laws and statutes, lessons learned about opportunities and challenges, resources where you can learn more, and then some specific recommendations for implementing the practice if it seems appropriate for your community. So there are too many best practices for us to cover all of them today, and each has its own specific recommendations. So instead of going into detail about each of those, I'll briefly note some of the overall recommendations in the report. Housing production all starts with land that is available for housing and plans that facilitate housing entitlements and permitting. So as you know, as part of the housing site selection process, suitable sites for housing must be identified. And recent housing laws have also created the opportunity to use public institutional land for housing, which in some communities can facilitate infill and transit-oriented development. Naturally, it's important that the local planning context reflect and be consistent with housing plans and strategies. Most importantly, the land use, safety, and environmental justice elements of the general plan should be aligned with housing element sites and fair housing strategies. Several land availability and planning examples from Valley communities are included in the report, including some award-winning general plans from throughout the region and the city of Fresno's proactive approach to infill development with its 2035 GP and subsequent adoption of an infill development act by the city council. The rubber really hits the road with housing production in the local code. And in the report, there are a variety of things that local governments can do to make the local zoning code more housing friendly. Some examples are listed on this slide and were addressed by both Ryan and Steve. So there are several examples of inclusionary zoning from the region. Many of these strategies on this slide are relatively new to the region. Therefore, some of the examples in the report come from across the state and from communities in other states that share similarities with the region. Though much of the costs of housing production are outside the control of local governments, like materials and wages, as Steve mentioned, there are steps that can be taken to reduce the cost of housing construction, particularly for affordable units. On the one hand, low-cost housing types can be enabled in the local code. There are some good examples in the report of code innovations across the region that facilitate ADU and cottage construction. Local governments, either on their own or in collaboration with other authorities and nonprofit developers, can also generate funds earmarked for housing to complement limited state and federal funding. As with the zoning code revisions, many of these strategies are relatively new to the region, so the report includes examples from across the state and nation. One of the major challenges with having the water, wastewater, and transportation infrastructure needed to support housing production is funding and financing. There are a variety of funding sources and financing strategies, so it is best to first develop a clear capital improvement program that is consistent with the housing plans, and then take a strategic approach to paying for it. The report includes a menu of funding and financing options to support this approach. Importantly, sometimes revenue sources can also become barriers to housing production, for example, with impact fees. So as part of capital budgeting and financing, we recommend to evaluate the cumulative impact on development and provide waivers, reductions, or deferrals of fees that can be impediments to affordable housing production. The report also includes a section focused on grants, including state and federal grant sources and grant writing resources. That concludes our presentation. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and Robert to facilitate the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Ron. All right, let's see. Do we have any questions from the audience? We do have an anonymous attendee. What are some of the reasons that jurisdictions oppose inclusionary housing, and what are some strategies to overcome those concerns? So I'm sure you looked at inclusionary housing as an option. I'm going to put my 2 cents in, then I'm going to turn over to Ron.
Michael, it's inclusionary zoning. The question
Okay.
is inclusionary zoning.
Okay, inclusionary zoning, very good. Okay, so I think it could work in some communities in the valley. I think it could be disastrous in some other communities, especially poor rural communities that don't could suffer from this in terms of discouragement of private sector investment. But I think a few have tried it, and so I'm eager to hear what your thoughts are, Ron.
Just to add to that, the typical critique is that it requires the development, it basically externalizes the cost of affordable housing and onto the market rate housing. And so while providing additional affordable units, often at 15 to 20% of a project, it then prices the remaining units at a higher level, making them even less accessible to other local residents. That's the most common critique I'm familiar with. Steve or Ryan, other things to chime in on inclusionary zoning?
No, I would agree with you that it can be a deterrent when you make that a requirement. I think I alluded to it earlier, but I would prefer to see more incentives built in, concessions that are granted in exchange for providing for more affordability. I think zoning codes that were built that way would create more opportunities and greater flexibility, especially in the design of units and compatibility with the surrounding market rate development that exists already.
And one other thought related to Michael's comment, it costs time and effort to administer these programs, and so it's administratively can be difficult for smaller jurisdictions. And then there's other issues around program design related to controlling, maintaining the affordability of units long-term, which again is a bit of an administrative chore, and just you need to make sure you design the program appropriately to retain the affordability of units across ownership.
Mm-hmm. And there's currently a low rate of inclusionary zoning ordinances across the valley. I think you found only 3 cities or 2 to 3 cities with some sort of ordinance like that in the valley. And the percentage is higher across the state. Is that correct?
Ryan, do you remember the exact number from the survey? I know you asked folks how many had inclusionary zoning.
I don't remember offhand. I'd have to look it up. I apologize.
All right, but that's a good question, and that's a good topic, and something that we should all be thinking about and discussing a little bit more as options for housing. Okay, any other questions? Let's see something. Robert, help me out. Here's a question, anonymous attendee. Are there funds available from the state to support with the administrative costs? So I believe they're following up to your question, to your statement about cost for small cities to administer this program. So they're asking, if I'm correct, they're still on the inclusionary zoning topic. Is there relief from the state to help administer this?
I apologize. I'm not personally familiar with resources that might be where that might be an eligible expense. Robert and Michael, would REAP be an eligible?
I don't. REAP in its current format, REAP 1.0, is not an eligible activity to support construction. However, REAP 2.0 in its draft sort of conceptual format could offer some relief. Keyword could, we don't know. The guidelines are still being developed, but REAP 2.0 will be coming to all the counties of California in a larger amount than REAP 1.0, and it's very possible that something creative like incentives to the private sector to deliver affordable housing could be offset administratively if it's included in some inclusionary zoning program or something like that. But I do not know. I'm just speculating. Robert Phipps?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about developing, the administrative costs associated with, or the developing the code itself, the zoning code, then that would be eligible, right? Under REAP 1.0.
Yes.
Which is kind of how I took the question, but I agree with you with regard to any kind of implementation. We did, one of the one of the, I think, well-known debates that we've had with HCD, had to do with eligibility for things like offsetting developer fees and funding, infrastructure banks, which are trust funds that, evidently are not eligible. You can establish one with REIT 1, for example, but you can't fund it. And so, that's been an ongoing point of consternation for most of us. But yeah, REIT 2.0 looks like it's going to be more flexible, but also have that additional requirement of being quote transformational. And so, the framework for that, if you're not aware, the framework for that was just released late last week. The draft framework for REIT 2.0 now available for your consideration and comment. So
Very good.
I don't see any other questions, but I would have some to kind of prime our panelists with here. Hopefully get the conversation going. In a macro sense, the Valley often talks about the fact that it has its demographics, its circumstances are different than those of the rest of the state, especially with regard to the major urban areas. And what I'm wondering is, because you all have a perspective, working in both urban and rural environments, or for and across the entire state and presumably elsewhere. Do you find that in the course of this project, have you found that to be true? Do you find major distinctions with regard to particular impediments and or probably to a lesser extent best practices, but with specific regard to impediments, do you find that the impediments here in the San Joaquin Valley are different than those you see in other parts of the state?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. I think the one impediment that I've seen that is fairly unique, especially in Kern County, is the setbacks that are required around oil drilling and oil production sites. When you start to connect all those lines together, you really eliminate a lot of land that might otherwise be available for development. And I totally understand the need for safety in that area. But maybe that is reason enough to increase density allowances within those areas that are not constrained by that, and develop some sort of incentive for providing and maintaining those areas.
I guess one thing I'd add to that is, the market itself is dramatically different. This is one example where the region is different from much of the rest of the state, the more urbanized parts of the state. But even within the region, there's significant differences in market, for instance, which, given that it's the market that largely drives housing production, has significant effects not only on the rate of production, but the type of housing built, and the type of housing desired by residents. There's a history, obviously, in a much more rural region of a less dense overall pattern of development. And so much of the more recent housing law is oriented more towards higher density development. And so there's that mismatch there between the history and even the current footprint in the area, with much of what communities are currently being incentivized, or in many cases required to do. There's more of the market that supports state type policy in proximity to the Bay Area. But in those cases, you're then, relying on very high transportation and VMT for residents. And so you've got a particularly difficult dynamic in the region between state requirements for housing and then the related but different state requirements for GHG reduction and VMT reduction.
I would say, just to add on to that, the most obvious difference would be the availability of land being so different between California's like the Bay Area and urban communities and the Valley. Certainly the governmental constraints involved in the housing elements will be different, because in the Bay Area, you have more land constraints, and in the Valley, you tend to have less density, right? And so looking at governmental constraints, there are some differences in between the Valley and major urban centers in the state.
Also a lot more planners. And so that's my, Robert, that's my question. A lot of the recommendations presented require somebody behind the counter at the jurisdiction to process that. And that's where we have a shortfall in the Valley, and that's the big concern. So how, I mean, how do we address that? Is there anything innovative or creative we could do? Maybe we can look at doing something under REAP 2.0. But at the same time, is there any movement to simplify the land use planning process so it's not so onerous, cumbersome on our planners trying to get their work done in our communities? Have you heard of anybody working on anything like that?
Just a quick note, for a separate project, was talking with somebody who has experience at the state level in the Office of Planning and Research, OPR. And I asked the question, so at the state level, are people in different agencies talking to each other and coordinating? Because on the ground level, when trying to implement it, seems like, you know, we're states sometimes asking us to work cross purposes. And he just chuckled and said, no, this is all, a lot of it's coming out of a legislature where, you know, one legislator has one set of priorities and is pushing legislation and maybe related to housing, another has other priorities and pushes just different but related legislation, and they aren't necessarily collaborating. And then the state agencies are in the position to have to reconcile what are sometimes competing priorities. And so I think, in contrast to simplifying things, I think the planning world, unfortunately, is getting increasingly complex and complicated and difficult and cumbersome. And as I was reading and reviewing all the material, I was thinking there in the region here, I think there's tremendous opportunity. How to do it, I'm not so sure. Maybe this is another REAP 2.0 opportunity, but there may be opportunities to do a lot of joint planning, particularly amongst communities who are in close proximity, have limited resources, but very similar characteristics, where they could perhaps jointly do some of these housing element updates, and maybe even in coordination with those updates of some of their other critical general plan elements. But that brings its own challenges as well.
No, I was going to suggest that as well. That partnerships, I think, work out really well. As an example, in San Mateo County, they created a group called 21 Elements, where they brought together all the different cities and the county, and they created a sub-region to determine their housing numbers. But along those same lines, not San Mateo, but Marin County brought together the same kind of a group to develop their objective development standards and design standards all together to create a kind of a uniform package that would apply countywide, which not only does it save money for individual jurisdictions to create that kind of information, but it sort of standardizes how all the different jurisdictions in there would apply it, which is also a savings, I think, when it comes time to make your applications.
Very good, thank you. Robert, you had another question? Sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, that's okay. No, I was just, you know, the other thing that I wonder is with regard to the concept of, you know, the cost burden, the housing cost burden, and the broader notion of disadvantaged communities. I wonder, you know, on the one hand, you think, well, disadvantaged communities, especially when it comes to a tool like Cal EnviroScreen, right? It really effectively is pretty binary. You're either disadvantaged or you're not, right? You meet that qualification or you don't. But is the characteristic, is the nature of a disadvantaged community in the Valley different than one in the metro area? Do you see differences in those realms, if you will, you know, that account or in some way influence the housing crisis?
You know, that's a great question, and I apologize. I have not myself taken a deep dive and looked at some of the environmental justice profiles of local communities in the region. So I can't answer that question directly, but I think it's an excellent point. And just one related point there is SB 1000 allows a community to a considerable amount of flexibility actually in identifying potential disadvantaged communities. You don't necessarily have to just use 2.0, which, takes a bit more effort, but can actually, to your point, Robert, allow a community to be clearer about who it is, which communities, and what disadvantages specifically they're facing, which can enable a community to more specifically tailor then programs and policies to address those needs. Part of my thought is that much of the data that is used in the housing needs assessment for housing element is also socioeconomic data that could be used at a local level to get a better handle on some of the socioeconomic dimensions of disadvantage. And so there are some opportunities for time and cost savings there, and an opportunity to thoughtfully coordinate housing element development, the AFFH component of that, and as required in some places, the updates to or production of the environmental justice element. And part of what we recommend, and we know it's a challenge, is to do these things in coordination, because then a community can be much more strategic about how it addresses specific disadvantages and meets the needs of communities within their local jurisdiction. One thing I do know is that there are a lot of disadvantaged communities across the region. What I can't speak to is your question specifically is what the characteristics of those communities are specifically.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I'm checking. It doesn't look like there are any. So it's almost 5 till, so we're gonna wrap this workshop up. We're supposed to have a workshop in December, still working on it, so I will communicate by email whether we maintain that schedule or not, but starting in January, definitely we'll have monthly workshops moving forward. December may be problematic, but we'll move forward January thereafter. So once again, thank you everyone for attending this webinar, and we'll talk to you soon via email, and see you on the next webinar.
Thank you.
See ya.